Looking for a little strange.
Welcome back, dear strangers. You are listening to Strange Bluegrass, and I'm SB Pearce, your host for all things weird and wacky about Kentucky. Now, I know normally I have a little spiel I do about what's going on in my life. I know you don't care, but I care, so I tell that to you. I also encourage you to come out and follow my social media and like, rate, and review my show across the different platforms, especially Spotify or Apple. We're not going to do that today. I might do it later, probably not, because this is going to be a great show. Today I am joined by Kurt Gohde, art studio professor at Transylvania University, and he is an expert on something you might not have heard of. Thank you for joining me, Kurt. How are you doing today?
Great.
So tell us first a little bit more about you.
I grew up in upstate New York on a pig farm, and then moved around a little bit for school, different colleges, and then ultimately came to Lexington and to teach at Transylvania University. So I've been here at Transylvania for 23 years. And I often will ask people to introduce me by saying I run really fast, although if you've been in the audience when I say that, I don't run really fast. It's just seems like a good way to start a conversation.
It is a great way to start a conversation. So you teach art studio here, and I did see a little bit of art history.
I used to teach a course called, it's like art appreciation,
Okay.
but I don't anymore. I haven't for a few years. I may again, but primarily I teach sculpture, photography, video, and a class called community engagement through the arts.
That's awesome. Love that because like I mentioned to you earlier, I graduated from UK with a double major art history and art studio with an emphasis in photography.
Okay.
So yeah, we're like minds a little bit that way, I think.
Yeah.
So this subject we're about to talk about, how did you first hear about it? Because you're not from Kentucky. You are a Kentuckian now, by the way, just so you know. You're transplanted here. Yeah, we own you. We have you. You're ours.
Excellent. Well, when There was once a discount book seller that came in a newspaper. I think it was called H.R. Hamilton or E.B. Hamilton or something Hamilton.
Okay.
And you would get this. I would get it in the news or in the mail probably once every 2 weeks, and there would be 400 books, most of which were just overstocks. Maybe they were all overstocks, but they were really inexpensive. And because they were inexpensive, I would buy things that normally I just would fascinate myself with a little bit, but not buy them. And so for a period of time, I started buying books of things like unusual weather phenomena. And that was slightly before moving to Kentucky. So I was still in graduate school, and I was just buying things that I thought were odd. And they mostly were books that now would exist only as lists on the internet. So they were lists of different things with not a whole lot of description. And when I moved to Kentucky and I was unboxing my books, I decided, because unboxing takes me months and months rather than just a regular amount of time, because I want to look at everything that I have as if it's brand new. And I looked through this book of weather phenomenon just in the index to see if anything happened in Kentucky. And so that's when I discovered the meat rain and started really asking everybody that I could, because I just assumed if it rained meat in Kentucky, everyone on the street would know.
Right. That seems like something that, yeah.
Turns out they don't.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I chatted with a few people before I came here today.
Yeah, so since then, when I tell the story, especially to students, I use it as an indication of the failure of the education system in the state of Kentucky, just because I feel like a successful education system would let you know if it had rained meat.
Right. That would have kept me interested in school, definitely. So you started asking on the street. How about you tell the story of what happened?
Okay, so the actual story of what happened is a pretty short thing. So on March 3rd, 1876, in Olympia Springs, Kentucky, and the way it's told is in a shadow of a specific mountain. And if you go to Olympia Springs, there's a mountain, it casts a shadow on a certain time of day, so you can kind of locate where this happened, on the farm of Alan Crouch. And the reason you would, if you were to go there and you want to locate it by the shadow of the mountain, is because if you do a genealogical survey for how many Alan Crouches there were that had farms in 1876 in Olympia Springs, it's like 7.
Oh, wow.
So you need to figure out which one it is. So, but on this particular farm, Alan was out in the fields and his wife was working in the yard, I believe in the garden, and she started noticing meat falling from the sky. And the report that she told, and the report that's most frequently told, is that it was a cloudless day, and she looked up and saw meat falling down from the sky and landing all around her. It fell for, I think, a period of like 7 to 11 minutes. I mean, it's a pretty short period of time over an area the size of a football field. And then, like, all of these tools of measurements become helpful because we know how big a football field is. They gathered up all the meat samples and they roughly filled a horse wagon. So there's another measuring tool that I actually have no idea how big a horse wagon is, but I like to say, like, oh, a horse wagon full of meat.
Yeah.
Seems like a lot.
I can picture it. Yeah, I get it.
And then that was it. And then it just turned into kind of a national sensation to try to solve what happened. So the state's best scientists went and collected samples and did research on them and then shipped them to other people around the country. And in a period of about maybe 2 weeks, it might have been longer than that, maybe a period of a few months, there were a number of different experts who said they think this is what it is, and a number of other people that said that thing's wrong, it's this thing. But there was never nobody ever really agreed. And then it was 1876, so something else interesting happened. You know, like, if this were to happen now, people would, like, drill down and drill down and drill down until they figured it out. But in 1876, they're like, it rained meat. These theories seem a little bit plausible. Let's go on to the next thing.
Right. I mean, it would be, I think if it happened today, I think the media would go berserk for about a week, maybe 2. But they also would eventually drop it and go on to the next sensational thing.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much how it happened.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got meat on a farm. About how big were these pieces of meat?
They ranged in size from like a fingernail size, like very, very small, to ones that were said to be like the size of a grown man's palm of his hand.
Okay.
And sometimes there are measurements, but that's ultimately, the size.
Yeah. Now, did anyone ever mention actually sampling the meat or eating, like having a cookout?
Yeah. Of course, that's the very first thing that people did. So I think maybe before the scientists got there, 2 locals started, I guess, not snacking on the meat, but eating it, because that's how you determine anything, even when you're a toddler. And you know, like, this thing's odd, put it in my mouth. And they determined that it was, from the taste test, the initial taste test, 2 locals determined it was mutton. Okay. And then another local, not quite as local, a man named Benjamin Franklin Ellington, who was interviewed not by a local paper, but interviewed in a really beautiful long interview by the Hartford Courant from Connecticut. And he talked about how it was definitely bear meat. And he knew it was bear meat because, well, one, he was the best bear hunter in the country. And so he had eaten a lot of bear meat. And conveniently, as the best bear hunter, his mother was also the best chef of bear meat. And he knew the greasy feel of it and the smell of it, and he knew even before he tasted it that it was bear meat. He was very, very convinced. So the taste test yielded either mutton or bear.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. if I would, oh, here's some meat. Like, I wouldn't do that today. Like, oh, there's some meat in my yard. Let me.
It just fell out of the sky.
Yeah. So, what are some of the theories? Because if we're looking at 1876, I know we did not have airplanes. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of slash at time travel. And I'm going to slash out paranormal. What are some of the theories that came up?
Not including those ones.
Well, I mean, you can include those because they're fantastic stories, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't know if there are any that fall into that. Well, one that was said only as kind of a joke, but it was an interesting joke, and I think this was in the New York Times. The New York Times wrote about it twice. And the first time, the joke part of it was that it was the result of a knife fight from two fierce Kentuckians finally hashing one another.
Just to fling it into the air.
And just like flies over the fence into the neighbor's field. But I don't think anyone believed that. It was just a good story. There was one that was really fascinating that was published in the New York Times and published in a series called something like the Tuesday Evening Fancies. It was a series that this writer wrote regularly about different things that are happening in the country. And he wrote about how the world at the time was starting to understand that asteroids that come in, meteors that come in are planetary fragments. So it could be a planet had exploded and then the fragments come in as meteors to Earth. I almost said through the atmosphere. This next part I tell you will make it clear that they had no idea that the atmosphere existed, because what he then went on to assume was that probably a planet had exploded that also had some animals on it.
Oh, okay.
And this is just where the animal shards came flying in. So
okay.
It was, he wrote about it, I think it was just generally called cosmic meat.
Right. Cosmic meat.
Yeah.
There should be a meat shop called that, I think. Maybe we can contact Critchfield and see if they'd be willing to change it up.
Yeah, so that was a great one. And there wasn't pushback because, now if you tell anyone that story, they're like, a whole cow is not going to make it through the atmosphere, even into a little shard. But at the time, they were like,
that would have seemed
that's perfectly believable.
Completely believable, yeah.
On to the next day.
Yeah.
Then there was another story that was interesting. This one has actually been retold in Olympia Springs in a number of ways that connected it with the Civil War, which is not the right time. But the people in Olympia Springs don't know a whole lot about the details. It's like this vague story that people tell one another about their town. But the idea was that there was some kind of feud between different farmers, and that one farmer had some cattle that died, and in order to basically poison the other farmer's cattle, they just put it in a cannon and blasted it into the other farmer's field.
Okay.
So this suggests that there are farmers blasting animals at one another.
They just have random cannons hanging around
with their cannon right next to their hay baler. So the theories were really kind of that absurd in their most grand sense, but they all started first with things that connect very well with like Fortean times, like Charles Fort, and different ways of understanding like animal rains. And so an animal rain, like a fish rain that happens or frog rain, tend to be written about or thought of as the result of, I think, what's called an upspout, where there's basically like a tornado that lifts things up, light things from an area of water, and sometimes there will be like rains of frogs and fish.
Oh yes, I've heard of that.
Yeah, so there's a movie called Magnolia where there's a frog rain in the end.
Right.
And usually rains that have to do with animals that are in water are explained in that way. So they're an upspout that picks up small light but solid objects and just drops them elsewhere. So that was one potential explanation when people believed that it was like a gelatinous, maybe egg casing.
Right.
Which, this is where the story of what the meat looks like all falls to pieces, because some people picked it up and eat it, and this story suggests it was like a gelatinous egg casing, and no one's going to say that's probably meat.
Yeah.
But the other explanation was a material called Gnostic. And Gnostic is a low form of vegetable matter that apparently expands when it gets wet and smells like meat.
Okay.
I don't know why it doesn't exist in the world anymore, but in 1876, I think if you said to someone, there's some Gnostic out in the field, people are like, oh, Gnostic, I've seen that.
Okay. Okay. Well, do you know if any scientists looked back then, or even since then, to see were there any kind of downspouts or tornadoes relatively close enough to, that it could have pulled up something and then shredded it in the air, and then through the crazy laws of physics managed to rain right here on this person's land? Like, strange things happen in nature. I get that. So it's,
I don't think anyone looked into I haven't seen anything that looked into the weather patterns. And I should say that the way I got most of my information was when Google Books started. It was all of their full page scans of every book were available to anyone in any academic institution. And so at that time, it just happened to align with when I was interested in two things really related to transy. One is meat rain and one is a Pasolinic telegraph. So I searched through Google Books and found like all of these full page scans, and that's when I was finding like what people did to study it. Okay. And I never saw anything where anyone actually looked at the weather. Someone used it as an explanation, and no one like questioned it enough to look at it.
Okay.
The one explanation that is still believed, and I guess because it is the most believable, was actually presented pretty early on by a man named Robert Peter, who was a professor here at Transylvania, and that has to do with vultures vomiting. So the idea was that vultures either ate something that was too gross for them to continue eating, or they were scared, and when vultures need to take flight, if they've eaten a lot, in order to take flight quickly, they just throw up whatever they've eaten. Okay. And so that theory, which really is the one that people who look into it tend to believe now, is that Miss Crouch, when she saw the meat coming down and she looked up and saw a cloudless sky, somehow missed a flock of vultures big enough to vomit over a full football field.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, she could have had extraordinarily poor vision.
Yeah. It was very bright out. Maybe.
Yeah, very bright. They could have been right inside that glare, right where you can't look at the sun, maybe. Yeah, that definitely. I don't think that theory holds.
So the theory, if you take away her firsthand account, really is the one that makes the most sense.
Right.
And it's hard to know how much of her firsthand account is really firsthand because it was told and told. The one firsthand account that wasn't told and retold is the Benjamin Franklin Ellington and Hartford Courant, because I don't know what it's called, but it used to be that if you were quoting somebody who spoke with a dialect, the newspaper would try to write in that dialect. And now people don't do that anymore. It's considered offensive because it is offensive. But by writing in that way, it really kind of cements that they were not, like, there's no part of his story that there's a result of being told and retold. So that part seems real, but again, that's just the taste of it. That's not whether it was a cloudless sky.
Right. Now, I don't know, because I did do an episode about very unusual weather happenings in Kentucky. And
what are the other ones?
Huh?
What are the other ones?
Oh gosh, I'd have to go back and look at my notes, because I've covered like fires and geothermal, like underground fire and above ground fire and lightning strikes, all different kinds of stuff.
Do you know the only, I believe, the only documented double spontaneous human combustion happened in Kentucky?
I don't think I came across that one.
Of course, it's not weather, so.
Right.
It's
No,
just an
well, I
unusual
mean,
thing.
but it still fits the show. Yeah, I want to look that up. So I can't remember if we recording weather data that far back on a reasonable scientific scale that where we could go, oh yes, it was this, it rained, it did this, it did that, because I know all of that. It progressed and got better. I mean, we still don't have the greatest weather forecasts, but we at least can look back with accuracy.
Yeah, I don't know when the weather recording as we do now started. I do know that when I first learned about the meat rain, and I started to search what other meat rains there might have been in the world, there just aren't a lot, but there were a fair number of red rains or blood rains, and sometimes that's related to minerals but when it happened, and the first person who gets it on them, it looked like blood, and they shout blood rain, then everyone thinks it's blood rain. But those types of rains that really have that kind of awful gravity of a blood rain or a meat rain, they were prior to 1876. They happened with enough frequency that it didn't seem alarming. After 1876, when this one happened, to my knowledge, there hasn't been one. And so my guess is that the actual scientific weather reporting started around that time.
They're probably well, maybe we should start writing something down.
Maybe that wasn't blood.
Yeah. We should take a note, get a journal, something. So there have been, or has been, at least one other meat shower somewhere.
I don't know about nothing is referred to as a meat shower, but there was a blood rain in Tennessee. I think that was 50 years earlier. That's a guess. I don't remember the exact date of that one. But I think other than that, the ones that are related that seem to be kind of... I don't even know if there was another one that was fragments of meat.
Okay.
I think it was either full animals or or blood.
Yeah.
This may be the only one where the animal was dismembered into little bits.
Okay, all right. Do you know if scientists took any local soil samples or grass samples? They probably weren't doing that level of gathering of data.
They weren't, and the states... So the reason that... one thing that worked out well, I suppose, for me, is the state's best scientists went to explore this, and at the time, the only scientists in the state were teaching at Transy, right? So, I mean, there might have been other scientists, but that's where, the only academic structure within the state was Transylvania. So, I don't think they gathered anything like that. In fact, it's my knowledge that most of the samples were collected by a man named B.F. Skinner, I think is his last name. And that's all he's identified as. And he is the person that's identified as having shipped them kind of around the country. And from the census kind of research that I've done to try to figure out who B.F. Skinner in Lexington was, there was a freed slave head of household in Lexington. His name was Benjamin Franklin Skinner. Now I feel like I need to fact check myself, because surely his name was not the same as Benjamin Franklin Ellington, the guy who tasted the... But could be.
It very well could be for that time.
Yeah.
There are a lot of name similarities when I do my research. It's sometimes hard to kind of keep, which person was this? So.
Yeah, so the person who I think collected most of the samples was not a scientist himself.
Okay.
I think he may have been somebody that I can imagine. In fact, I had read something at one place at one point in an old notebook at Transy that made it seem like there was somebody named Skinner, and it didn't say B.F. Skinner, but somebody named Skinner that was providing different kind of specimens for the medical school.
Okay.
So I had kind of imagined that maybe he was someone that the faculty employed to get things.
Oh, okay.
So they said, go get some of that horse wagon full of meat for us.
Yeah.
And he probably had no training to even think about soil samples.
Right.
But at the time, I mean, you have to also remember this is, I think, probably around the time when Dr. Dudley, who was another professor here at Transy, revolutionized medicine by inventing the process of washing your tools between operating on one patient and another.
Okay.
Just like, rather than just wiping them off on the grass.
Somehow I think I've heard of that. It might have been when I came here to visit the museum.
Yeah.
I've not done that show. You have to wait. So yeah, maybe that's where I heard of that.
Yeah. So what science was then was nothing like what we think of science now.
Right. Yeah, I guess if that's something that had never been taught or was even part of the process, most people probably wouldn't think to be like, well, let me just. It's not like we had Ziplocs hanging around or anything. Let me just stick this in a tissue for later.
No Ziplocs. One story seemed to imply that local dogs were also eating up the meat, right? So if that is true, then there was a little bit of urgency as well.
Right. Okay. So this football field sized area, was that just their farm, or did that encompass more than one farm?
I've never heard any other mention of a different farm.
Okay.
I think it was just theirs.
Okay. Because now I have to stop and think. It's like, okay, we have a lot of, caves. We have a lot. I don't know about coal fires for that time period, but excuse me. Could we have had some kind of geothermal activity that could have transpired? Maybe a bear crawled into the wrong hole and it just did not end well for the bear. Like, that's not totally unreasonable, even though it probably would make more sense out in Yellowstone or something like that.
Yeah. Well, there is, when I went there, so I've been to Olympia Springs a few times to see if I could find the location. I'm not sure what I thought I would find at the location if I found it, but I really wanted to find the location and to talk to people. And there are a few things that are interesting connections, and I never thought of this one until you asked about geothermal. There's like an old smelting plant there,
okay.
And it's just a roadside attraction that you can stop at and see where they were. And I don't know when it was operating, but it was, I don't know, there's a plaque on it that says it was important for making cannonballs or whatever it was making at the time.
Okay.
So.
Okay. All right. Well, so in your opinion, or do you have a different theory of your own that you have formulated? Is there one of these theories that are out there that you're like, yeah, probably, or do you have a different idea?
Well, unfortunately, if I had to probably, I would go with the vulture story.
Yeah.
But I do have my own idea, which isn't believable to anyone, but I find it to be a very fun narrative that connects that double spontaneous human combustion as well.
Oh, okay.
With the Stanford alien abduction. Is it Stanford? One of the there's an alien abduction story that took place in Kentucky, I think in the 70s.
That was Stanford, yeah. I think
that is often spoken of as the most believable one because the three women that were abducted were separated and told very similar stories. Mm-hmm. And so I have to say this is my favorite story, and it's one I made up, and I don't believe in abductions, but I love the idea that potentially in 1876 there were some aliens that said there's this interesting place called Kentucky, and let's pull up some of those things. And those things happen to be sheep. And in this story, they're pulling up on like a tractor beam, like we've learned to understand in movies, but they just forgot to open the doors, so the sheep get pulled up and then they splatter and they fall back down.
Oh, okay.
And then, like 50 years later, they come back to Kentucky, and they figured out how the doors work, and instead their tractor beam is too hot, and that's why there's the double spontaneous combustion. And then another 50 years later, they come back in Stanford. Now, I don't think these are actually separated by 50 and 50 years, but because they haven't spun this version of an invented story for a while.
Right.
But I like connecting the three most kind of bizarre things I think have happened in Kentucky all into one story.
There have been some strange things. I do some unexplained crop circles that they could not define as a hoax and different things like that. So, it's hard to say. Kentucky's supposed to have, we're supposed to have our own little unique areas down closer to Tennessee where a lot of activity, alien sightings and stuff like that, or UFO sightings have occurred. I come across it all the time. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to do that story or not, but it's still good for the show. Right?
It is. Yeah, I do think the vulture vomit one makes sense.
It does.
Except for the part of her not seeing a flock of vultures that's that big.
Right.
But I can see how that would have become something like from the newspaper that tells the story, the local newspaper, reminding everybody that on that day, remember that day a week ago? There was a clear cloudless sky.
Right.
And then that became the story. Not like, maybe not her telling it. It was just like,
right.
This is the framing of the context. There was not storm clouds, and then it rained me.
Right. And it may be one of those things. So, crime investigations and stuff like that, well, we kind of grow, we live in a world now, or a time now where, you're kind of told if something happens, pay attention to what's going on around you and try to remember as much detail as you can. They didn't do that back then. No. So there could have been a flock of vultures, and she probably didn't think anything of it.
Yeah.
And it maybe, but by the time that she got interviewed or the story made it to wherever, it could have just been gone. Mm-hmm. Like her brain just filtered that right out, because that happens to a lot of people.
Yeah, and also because a flock of vultures might be weird, but raining meat is weird enough by a measure that you might just think like, I don't know if I saw any birds.
Right.
I was hit in the head with meat that came.
Right. I would be very concerned. I think I would have to go to bed for the rest of the day. I'd be like, I don't know what that was. I don't want to know. I don't even know if I would tell anybody. Like, we're just going to put that, we're going to bury that down. We're not going to talk about it.
Yeah. So. But mostly, I really like that at that time, they didn't need to solve it.
Right.
And there are ways in which I think we've lost a lot by just not accepting some things as fantastical and having to explain all of it away. But I can tell you that when I'm asked Rachel Maddow, I was interviewed on the Rachel Maddow show about this, because when something weird falls out of the sky, now people always Google like other weird things that fell out of the sky, and then meat ring comes up. So there was a bird death that happened that she talked about, and that connected her people to this story. And then she also connected with the vulture expert just to ask, like, is this possible? Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah, totally believable. Like, it didn't, there's no part of it that seemed improbable to him.
Right. And as a bird, at least from my own personal experience, I'm not a bird expert. In Louisiana, we had flocks of them, and there would be a bunch all together, and I would pull my car over and photograph them being disgusting, because that's the kind of thing I shoot. So, but yeah, there was not just one, it would be a bunch, at least where I lived, and that could be different in other parts of the country, for all I know.
Yeah, and that they have to do it to fly makes sense.
Right.
The first time I heard it, and someone said, like, maybe they ate something that was too gross. I'm like, what is too gross?
Right.
So the something was so gross that vultures threw it back up, and then two locals came and said, tastes like mutton. Somehow I don't think that's how it works.
Right? Yeah. I mean, it is testable.
It is testable.
It is testable. We could maybe feed some mutton or some bear to some vultures in captivity. See if we can get them to throw it back up. I don't know how scientific this would be, how well this engages the steps we're supposed to go through, and then we could taste test it. I don't know of anybody that's going to volunteer for that.
Well, so you didn't know about the taste test that I did?
I heard something about a candy or
a
jelly.
candy.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know who would volunteer for it, but the sample that we have, I at one point tried to get someone to do run DNA on it to see if they could determine what kind of animal it was, because I figured that testing wasn't available then. And what quickly came back was this sample is totally contaminated and basically unreliable for anything. But they sent me some information about what the closest match was, and it was some very specific breed of goat, a Peruvian goat.
Okay.
But they also said it's contaminated and it could be off in this number of different ways. So, don't bet on that being accurate.
Right.
But at the same time, they sent back basically like it's been contaminated because it's been in this type of solution and it just wasn't preserved as it should have been preserved. And I worked with a taste laboratory in Cincinnati and said, like, okay, if it's been in these solutions, can you reverse engineer what it might taste like if you took those tastes out?
Oh, okay.
And I don't know whether they actually thought they could, but they loved it as an idea and a project. And so they made jelly beans that were supposed to taste like what this tasted like. And they were terrible.
Oh.
They were so bad. But I went with another friend to Court Days. You know Court Days?
Yeah.
And we went around and we told people the story and we asked them to taste them. So we were doing our own taste test.
Right.
Of like this chemical formulated version of what it might taste like. And two things happened. One, my friend, another artist, people wouldn't taste it unless he ate one with them.
Oh.
So they're like, if you eat one, I'll eat one. So then he's fine, he's eating them. And after 8 or 10 of them, he just started getting really queasy. But people would be really confident about what they tasted. Yeah. But their confidence would be stuff like, that bacon that comes in a package you don't have to cook? It tastes like that.
Okay.
And I thought, oh, that's somewhat believable. And then another person just said, strawberry pork chop. That is definitely strawberry pork chop. Okay.
Well, no, that's an interesting because people do taste foods in different ways. So we learned recently that one of our children, they are a super taster. They cannot have anything spicy. They've been like this their whole life. I was like, they'll grow into it. But no, probably never. They can't do carbonated beverages because all of it just they're a super taster. Yeah. So,
but they can get fascinating jobs when they get older.
Right. Because we ended up ordering the test strips because they had done this at school. So I was like, oh, what's the rest of us? And so we're all like,
don't taste anything.
Put more pepper on that, thanks. So we kind of make their food a little bit, leave some out, or they just eat something altogether different if it's too spicy or whatever because of that. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it was interesting to see what kind of tasters these people are with this candy. Do you have any more?
I don't. I feel like I had a few of the sample containers left, but I don't know where they are. I know that I came back from Court Days with enough to film a few more taste tests here in Lexington. And I know that I probably had one full container left. It came in these, I got 12 small containers.
Yeah.
But I don't know where it is currently.
Yeah.
It's probably been 10 years since I did that.
Now, this taste laboratory that you worked with, did they get to keep the recipe, or is that your recipe because it was your idea, or?
Unfortunately, they didn't give me a recipe. so I don't have the recipe. And I tried to contact them like a few years later, and they're not there anymore. So I'm sure I have the name of a person that I was working with, and I might be able to find him, but the lab itself is closed.
Okay.
I think I found them because they were marketing on the internet that they would make scratch and sniff books of anything.
Oh.
So they were interested in doing like experimental taste and smell.
Okay.
And my guess is that the business just didn't take off.
Yeah, that would be a tough one. That'd be a tough one. I was just thinking about, is it called Birdie's Bots?
Yeah.
I was like, maybe one of those disgusting folks, because some of those are nasty.
They're really bad.
Yeah. I mean, I've bought them before for like my kiddos, and I think I did that one time, and I ate one. I was like, one's enough.
Yeah, I used to have a student that we would, like once a week, we would each try matching ones.
Mm-hmm.
And also the ratio in that box is way off. Like 2/3 of them are gross. It's not half and
Right.
half.
It's like they're going out of their way to be gross.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. I don't think. So I love your theory, like your idea of these fantastical things coming together. And I know I said no time travel, but like if I were to entertain time travel, it could be somebody re-entering back into that time period, and it didn't go so great. Yeah, I mean,
You just don't get through the portal before it slams shut.
right, it slammed shut right on them. And it probably has it's probably like a circular portal with like the teeth that close down like a camera lens, like inside a camera lens or something. So making the chunks.
So there was one thing that a recent development, which is super exciting, also because the meat rain. This is a long time ago. There are no recent developments, but for a long time I had tried to track one other sample that I knew existed, or I shouldn't say no existed. One other sample that we had record of, and that was given to a transient alum. Not given to him. He had it and kind of took it with him. And that was someone in the Breckenridge family, and it was kind of passed down in a number of different ways. And it seemed, I had reason to believe that it was potentially owned by a woman named Solange Prasad, who lived, because she was a wife of a man in that family, who then it became kind of convenience marriage, and he came out as gay, and they were divorced. And she ended up with a lot of the family's things. So I, like a weird stalker, tried to contact her, I don't know, 24 times in California, and she responded to me as she should to a weird stalker, and never responded. But about a month and a half ago, someone sent me some questions about the meat rain, and I answered. And he was a publisher for a microscopy journal, which is the name of a lot of the journals that wrote about the meat rain the first time, because it was shipped to different microscopy labs. In 1876, microscopes were becoming readily available to people, and so it was a hobby that people were looking at and studying things. And so that's one of the places it was most heavily written about. So I just said to him, I will answer all your questions, and I hope you publish it in the journal. That's what he was going to do. And maybe you'll find a sample, because I know that if there's another world that would have a sample, it would be your world. And he just sent a message back saying, I guess I should have led with that. I have a slide. Okay. And so he has a slide that was originally prepared, and it, unlike the sample that is here at Transy, his slide, they've actually remounted it twice, and the way it was done used all the right materials, and it was, I mentioned to you earlier that there was a man from the University of Kentucky that was buying up slide collections from this collection from some other microscopist, and the man who now owns this meat rain slide only happened to get this particular collection at the meat rain because the man who was buying all of them on eBay had a faculty meeting. And so now I know of at least one other sample. and it's a sample that's, it's been declared by people who know how to declare samples not valid, well preserved.
Viable,
it's been declared that. So that's exciting, except like I know so little about preparing a microscope slide. I don't know how much you can get from that tiny amount.
Oh man, back in my college years, my sister would have to even focus my microscope for me. That's how little I know about that process. I would break slides. I was like, I can't do it. She would have to fix it for me. Thankfully, we had the same professor, and he was very kind about it. So I'm in the arts, but just don't use that equipment. So
yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us? No. Okay.
I'm good.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you meeting with me.
Yeah, thank you.
I think the folks are the strangers. That's what I call them, the strangers. I think they're gonna love it, and I'm looking forward to putting this one out. So, should we shake hands?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, that was Kurt Gohde about the Kentucky meat rain, and I hope you enjoyed that. And there is data out on the internet. Be careful with that, though. We've talked about this in the show. You can't always trust what you read on the internet, but you can definitely trust his research. That's all I have for you today. And if it rains meat, get some Ziplocs. That's all I got for you. Is keeping strange. Strange Bluegrass is a Low Light Publishing LLC production. Copyright 2021. All rights are reserved.